I'm Darby Mead, and I'm the principal here at Vancouver iTech Preparatory.
My name is David Midkiff, and I'm one of the teachers at iTech.
And my name is Gil Luna. I support science instruction in the curriculum department in Vancouver.
Just a brief introduction about Vancouver iTech Preparatory. We are an early college model school that's located on the campus of Washington State University, Vancouver. We are a public school of choice within the Vancouver Public School District. We use STEM and project-based learning to provide a vigorous curriculum for our students to get them prepared for those college-level classes as early as their freshman year. What we're going to be talking about today is a specific system of standards-based grading that we have developed and how we have come to translate individual standard scores into a final letter grade. So I'm going to turn it over to David Midkiff to start us off.
All right, so we decided to name our system GAGE, and GAGE stands for Grading for Academic Grit, or Grading for Academic Understanding, Grit, and Excellence. Now, what we wanted to capture in that name was, yes, the learning, but also the process of learning from the very beginning stages to the final end product. So what we're looking at today is really, I think, two objectives, or two kind of outcomes. The first one we're going to be addressing is really around the background. And so for some of you new to standards-based grading, this is perhaps the primary value for you is what is standards-based grading, what exactly do we mean, and how is it approached, what's the common dialogue? Secondarily, and perhaps more appropriate to those of you who have some familiarity and maybe already wading into the conversation yourself, we're going to be sharing a bit about our specific approach, how we attempted to enter this process and how we came to troubleshoot some of the common pitfalls that come up as you begin to practice standards-based grading. So first, a little bit of background. When we're talking about standards-based grading at iTech, what we're referencing is, I think, a common definition for standards-based grading in which we are approaching learning that assesses students' growth towards specific academic outcomes. So that may be something particular like graph reading, or on the ELA side, it may be being able to identify a theme in literature. And what we want to be able to do is measure students' proficiency in discrete, specific skills, what are commonly referred to as standards. Now, a little bit of background. There's a lot of great thinking out there by Rick Wormeli, as well as others. And the whole goal of standards-based grading is really to, first and foremost, communicate meaningful feedback about students' ability to accomplish specific skills. Now, we want them to be specific because we know that all students are not the same, and we want to give them actionable items, things that are specific to that student. We also want to separate out learning from compliance and separate out behavior from actual knowledge as well as skill proficiency. We wanted to separate those out because simply using a grade as a classroom management tool could undermine the actual learning that occurs in our classrooms each day. Third and fourth, what we really wanted to look at in standards-based grading is where does a student start and where do they end? In other words, what is the process that they go through to learn and master a skill? We also wanted to focus on, rather than just work completion, rather than just, doing enough work to earn a certain grade, we wanted to focus on the actual complexity, the quality of the work. And so, as a result, standards-based grading often emphasizes fewer high-quality assessments rather than homework completion or the use of extra credit to provide simply more of the same. But these high-quality assessments really focus on depth of learning and application of specific skills rather than just more practice.
So what you'll see here is 2 tables, and what I'd like for each of you to do is just take a moment, take a look at these 2 tables and think to yourself, does the data represented in these 2 tables accurately capture what these students have learned or not learned? And I'll give you a moment to take a look at these tables. So what you might begin to notice is that the 2 tables really do not provide any information about the progress of learning. Specifically, what you might see is that in Table 1, not only does it not capture the learning or recognize progress, but the averaging system that you see here is only showing the average of attainment of a variety of scores. And in Table 2, there's really no information about what is really being assessed.
Mm-hmm.
So what we might think about is, what learning does Table 1 and 2 reveal? And again, it's not revealing much about what the students are specifically learning and whether or not they're making any progress to any type of goal. And so when we think about this, what we're really looking at is a very traditional method of grading that is not very transparent. And what we could look at even further, specifically in Table 1, is that with student 1 and 3, although they earn high scores on assignments that they have completed, overall, the achievement, what the student is being credited for is a very low scoring grade. And then likewise, when we begin to look at Table 2, what we see there is that although the scores appear to be in some cases high scores, there's really no explanation of what those scores represent in terms of mastery of learning. And that's really our goal with standards-based grading in our new system, or with our system, is to really recognize progress and to also recognize and be really transparent with what the learning goals are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to let people know that they can still chat with questions for you along the way, if that's okay. We haven't gotten anything yet, but feel free, all of you out there in the audience, to ask questions through that chat window.
And we will do some time for questions here in just a moment. So we have 3 windows throughout the presentation that we will address questions. So feel free to write those in, and we'll let you know when we get there, and we can answer those as we progress through the PowerPoint.
Excellent. I'll keep track of those for you. Thanks.
So as we started to venture into looking at standards-based grading, looking at how it might, the implications it might have on our practice, we saw that with our students, we could identify gaps in their learning. And we were identifying those at all levels, especially, at the high school. And one of the things that we realized is we are a 6 through 12 school, so we could not blame it on the middle school. We had to look at our own practices and see what is it that we're doing that's not allowing students to develop in all areas, in all standards. So we saw a problem with these learning gaps, and we recognized it had to do with how we were processing and converting grades. We were using percentages. We would take the standards that were covered over the course of the semester in a class, and we would average those together. We knew that our rubric work was emerging, and our students were emerging, but the grades that they were getting did not necessarily reflect what they knew or what they could do. We valued the rubric work that standards-based grading allowed us to do, and we knew we wanted to stay on that path, but our question was, how do we address those gaps that we were seeing in student learning. The next thing that we did is we started to research and explore standards-based grading and what models were out there. And as you can see, this is just a small portion of what we found as we started to research. What we began to understand is that there are a number of different definitions, and the further we researched, the more questions we had. We did look at a variety of research, including Stiggins, Marzano, many others also looked at different models and schools that use standards-based grading. And again, we found that there was a lot out there and that there was a lot of variety. So that was our initial venture into standards-based grading. And what I want to do at this point is open it up for any questions that people might have up to this point.
Yeah, it looks like a question came through wondering if this can be applied at an elementary level. We know that you are a middle school to high school, so what would that look like, or have you heard of other schools doing that?
Absolutely. They would just take the standards for their state or Common Core standards and apply this process with those. So everything we talk about is applicable at any level based on standards.
Okay, excellent. Looks like that's our only question right now. I will keep letting you know when there's questions coming through.
Excellent, excellent. So the second objective is we are going to share an approach to applying the principles of standards-based grading that we have come to use and is our current model. Now, in all transparency, this is something, you know, we're a year into and we are still modifying. This is where we're at right now. This is what we found to work best for us at this point. And it's a way that we think works well and can be applied to a variety of different situations in schools. This is where things start to get a little bit unique. Up to this point, really, we've just kind of summarized the information that's out there. Now this is how we apply standards-based grading here at ITEC. Now,
can I ask one quick question that just came through?
Absolutely.
Angela asked, how do you identify the learning gaps and which tools were used?
That is an excellent question. So we identify learning gaps through, we have a number of different ways where we look at the gauge spreadsheet that we use, which we'll show you in a little bit, tracks where students are at each attempt on a standard over the course of the semester. And I'm going to let David Mickiff, one of our teachers, chime in on that as well.
So I guess, you know, if we're to back up and look at one of the most I guess, basic components of standards-based grading. The Common Core State Standards or Next Generation Science Standards lay out specific skills and, in some cases, content and knowledge that have been determined by groups for a particular grade level. So, in my context, for the 9-10 band of English, there are specific standards related to the ability to analyze how a character is developed within a piece of literature, such as a novel. There's, as a separate standard, the ability to analyze and evaluate the development of theme or the use of word choice to impact tone. And those skills are separate and unique. Now, what I saw as a teacher was students' ability to do one thing but not the other. And maybe another student can do the first thing, but they can't do the second thing. And so those students were not the same. I saw gaps in the quality of learning, but those students may still end up with the same grade, but for very different reasons. Now, some of that's determined by some of my own in-class assessments. Other pieces of that, I was looking at our SBAC or state assessment scores, as well as some district reading diagnostics that we use to identify some of those learning goals where I realized the gaps are not the same across students. To simply say we need to improve as a class in reading literature doesn't give attention to the ways individual students need to improve. Does that answer the question? Is there, perhaps if it doesn't, when we kind of circle back to our second or third question session, we can hit that question again if you mull it over.
Yeah, I think looks like one other question that came through is, do you assign proficiency levels to the standards or break the standards down into different proficiencies, beginning, proficient, advanced, for example?
Yes. So one common thread that you'll see within standards-based grading work is the development of rubrics, and rubrics that are fairly narrow on their point scale. The classic, I think, question is, are you going to be able to, on a 100-point scale or a more traditional grading scale, be able to defend the difference between a 71 out of 100 and a 72 out of 100 to a student? The answer is probably not. You're not going to have 100 different levels of proficiency. Within standards-based grading, they often advocate for a 0 through 4. So you have a 1, 2, 3, and a 4 level of proficiency, or if you wanted to think about it as exceeding standard is the 4-point, meeting standard is the 3-point, approaching is 2, and well below would be the 1. So we went that route, and that's primarily represented in like Robert Marzano's work, is using a 4-point scale like that. In our case, we chose to include 0.5s to represent where students could attain the next level of proficiency with teacher help or with guided support of some kind. And that really allowed us to flesh out, what exactly am I asking for at grade level? What do I mean when I say a student is exceeding grade level? And what do I mean when they're approaching but they haven't quite met that grade level expectation for that given standard?
Okay, thanks.
So if that's what we've got for now, we'll move on to the presentation and we'll circle back for some more questions later.
That sounds great.
So as we, and go back one slide here, as we looked at how are we going to apply standards-based grading to our system, we realized that there are a few constraints that high schools specifically, but really at any level, a few constraints that we had to work within, realities we had to deal with. These are things we couldn't change, and we had to be fair to our students. We are an early college model, and we are preparing them for college. So we realized that, number one, colleges accept grades. We need a letter grade and figure out some way to come to a letter grade from the standard scores. We also realized that grades are currency. If our students are getting high inflated or deflated grades in relationship to other students, that isn't ethical, and we needed an ethical way to transfer an A to F our standards-based grading system to the A to F scale, like I said, ethically and clearly, so that our students could understand and that our students could use that in getting into college and those types of things that they're looking at. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Midkiff.
So I guess the first big question we had to face was, does averaging represent learning? And the short answer to that we came to, and I think standards-based grading comes to, is no. Rick Wormley speaks about this quite a bit. And the concern that we had was that student A could do really well on standard 1, really poorly on standard 2, and they would, through averaging, get a, let's say a 70% or a C, a all right score, not, not quite at grade level, but approaching. Similarly, student B could do really poorly on standard 1 and well on standard 2, and they would end up with, through averaging, the same score as the first student. And we said that's a problem, because those students and their learning ultimately is not the same. They may end up with the same percentage, right, what we normally use to determine our A through F scale, such as 80 to 85 or 90% plus. if they end up with the same score, we haven't really done our due diligence to represent their learning based on their individual proficiencies. And so we said we have to tackle this question first. So that led us to a couple things that we wanted to think about. So first we wanted to, like I think we've already highlighted, we wanted to assess individual standards, and we wanted to do that through that 4-point rubric work that I was just referencing a moment ago. We also wanted to, like was referenced by Mr. Mead, assess the combination of standards. So once we've got a student's proficiency on standard 1, 2, 3, and 4, we had to be able to translate that in combination to a through F letter grade. And ultimately, we, like I hinted at before, determined that this averaging hides performance, that a student can just do more of the work that they already do really well and avoid the areas that they need to improve in within a given discipline. So what we came up with is what's called a decaying average. And this is not necessarily new to us, but we wanted to apply it to standards-based grading for individual standards for a couple of reasons. So before we talk about the reasons, I want to back up and provide some definitions. So in the case of a decaying average, what is happening is that the most recent score is worth the most of a student's overall score on a standard. So a student may have a 3.5 overall on the standard, and ultimately their most recent demonstration is going to account for the largest percentage of that. We ended up choosing 87.5%, so 7/8 of a student's overall score on a individual academic standard would be represented by their most recent and hopefully most complex demonstration of their ability to accomplish that skill. Now, the reason why we didn't choose to just say 100%, that the most recent score is their most recent attempt and that represents their entire score, was because we also wanted to honor the process. We wanted to recognize that learning isn't just about a one-time dipstick mark. It's about consistency. It's about the ability to apply something over time, not just in a given moment. And so by weighting it at 87.5%, we did want to give some credit or some attention to process to encourage consistency, or that grit that we referenced in our acronym GAUGE. Now, I'm going to take us out of the actual presentation for just a moment to look at a sandbox, because decaying averages and talking the math like this without a visual is not particularly helpful, and it sounds just a little bit like black magic, and that's about it. So let's talk numbers. So on the left and the right, what you've got is two examples of this decaying average. On the right, that one's going to essentially stay the same so that you can see it for sake of comparison. Now, what you'll see is that score 1, 2, and 3, those would be scores on one standard. So in my context, this might be theme in literature. And the first score, the student scored a 2, second, a 2.5, and the third, a 3. Now, what you'll see in the bottom box, the average, that slightly green one, is a 2.5. That is their mathematical average of their score. What you'll see in the column to the right is how their most recent score comes to represent the majority of their learning, but that the early learning is still included in that decayed average, as opposed to just a pure average. And so you'll see that the student, of course, in their first score, their score is not going to decay because they only have one score, so the decayed average is going to be a 2. Now, they score a little higher on the next one, the 2.5. you'll see that the decade average on that standard is a 2.44, and you'll see that, again, the second score represents most of that, right? It's closer by a significant amount to 2.5 than it is to 2, but it isn't going to be the same as if a student scored a 2.5 on the first one and a 2.5 on the second one. We wanted to be able to show the growth, that movement from a 2 to a 2.5. So there's a quick explanation of what you're looking at. In the left side, we'll actually jump over and do some manipulation here. So let's say a student starts with a 1. This is a standard, an academic skill they know very little about.
Give me just a second.
Yep, just a moment. We've got a couple technical difficulties. So what we'll be looking at in just a moment here, there we are. Again, let's say that a student knows very little to start, and then they grow, and with help they're on the second assessment approaching standard, but only with help. They're still needing teachers' help or guidance to be able to meet that level, but by the third score, they do actually meet the standard. What you'll see is that the decade average does, over time, grow to show their ability to meet that standard without penalizing them. Now, in this instance, you'll see that the decade average, because of that growth, matches. Now, let's say we take score 2, though, and bring it down to like a 2. Let's say they're solidly at that 2 level. Let's see, is our math calculating? Make sure it is. Okay. So, hey, there we are. So, let's say that goes down to a 2. What you'll see is that right column, column C, changes just a little bit. Dramatically, no, but a small amount, and again, we were trying to show this process of growth over time as they progress through a standard on multiple assessments. So what I want to do right now is, again, pause for questions, because I realize, this is perhaps one of the biggest and most unique features of our grading system. If you've got questions or you want to see a certain scenario run with a certain set of scores, feel free to ask questions now.
Great. I have a question from Stephanie asking if you are able to set up decaying averages in your school's gradebook system, like PowerSchool, for example, or do you have to create your own gradebook that's more specialized?
That is an excellent question. So we use a system called Skyward, and it is a 0 through 100 percentage-based system. So for reporting grades, and we don't actually report a letter grade until the end of the semester. We stay with the individual standard scores throughout, and we have a spreadsheet that we'll include in a folder that we can send to you and hopefully post with this. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be able to share.
So we'll include our gauge spreadsheet. Teachers are able to input different scores on standard attempts, and it does all this calculation for them. And then what we do is from that, we'll talk about how we combine that into a letter grade, and then we just kind of trick the system and come up with a number that represents the grade that we want from that spreadsheet.
Well, if I can chime in on this one, somehow I knew that would be the first question that we got asked on this, and big smile to my face, because that naturally is, one of the biggest pieces is, all right, this is all great, but, how do you represent this to students? How do you report this out to parents? And, the honest answer to that is that it's been a huge process. We've had to get a lot of school, parent and student feedback, teacher feedback, and the system that we've got is kind of this, manipulation of what our district reporting system will allow us to do. You know, perhaps in the future we have something that represents our system accurately, you know, one-to-one without us having to pull any kind of, you know, magic or kind of manipulate things to make that happen. So, you know, I will say it is a process. It has taken quite a bit of time and testing and failure to get it to do what we want, but it can be done with a little bit of thought and digging.
Well, that takes us to our other question. How did you kind of begin communicating this process to parents? And what was the reaction there?
When we started to roll it out, we have different, you know, parent nights that are fairly well attended. So we shared it with parents as we were implementing, as well as, you know, students, and got feedback from that. We're fortunate enough to have a very good relationship with our community and a level of trust. And so they were, you know, active participants in giving us feedback on developing this system. It is, like Mr. Midkiff said, it is a process, and, you know, in full transparency, we still have parents who are to some degree confused in how to help support their students. So it's an ongoing process of, you know, initial testing, getting feedback from parents, but then it's an ongoing process of how do we get this information to parents. What current things we're working on, standards-based grading handbook that we can give to parents that explains standards-based grading in our system. And we've also developed screencast type 5-minute videos that walk through what our system looks like and how parents can interpret it so they have a level of literacy so that they can help support their students.
I think also on the student perspective, it really is holding their hand through the process. We used this process last year, and so there were lots of questions, lots of confusion, lots of, all right, let's talk about it again. And, you know, honestly, what I did really heavily in the beginning of this year in my courses is as students got individual scores on standards or on multiple standards, I walked them through it. I gave them, you know, a simple version of the math and said, all right, let's plug in our scores, let's grab a calculator, and let's break this down. Let's understand where we're at by getting them to get their hands on the actual math of it. And I think that in large part, you know, year 1 to year 2, this being our second year, really did help inviting students into, you know, the math of it rather than them just feeling this is just another system that spits out a letter grade for me.
And I do want to add one point to that kind of from a building perspective. I've had 2 teachers specifically, you know, that I know of that have come and talked to me about students that had identified there's a standard they're emerging in, let's say in Mr. Midkiff's class, and in my class they had a project with that same standard because there is crossover that they did well on. Students are able to identify that, and they're able to advocate to teachers, hey, here is an example of work I did in another class that shows proficiency of that standard. Can I use that? And our teachers have been very flexible in understanding that, yeah, that is demonstration of a standard, and the power for a student to be able to understand and advocate for themselves in relationship to their learning has been, I think, a hugely powerful, you know, tool for us.
That's excellent. I can imagine that would ease some of that anxiety for students when it comes to assessments and just having the one kind of shot to demonstrate proficiency.
Yeah. Do we have other questions, or are we
just a couple more if you guys are up for it. One question came in asking about how many assessments are incorporated into score 1. Is it just one score, meaning summative, or are students able to retake the assessment multiple times?
So each of those scores do represent one assessment. Now, for a general, like for a project, for a unit in curriculum, what we try as a you know, minimum is to say that you should have 3 scores or 3 formal assessments of a given standard. That allows you to have you know, a relatively accurate data set. Now, for students who want to retake and revise and redo, they're certainly welcome to, and that, maybe for a number of reasons. Like, let's be honest, if a student's score fluctuates between the first and second assessments, but they need to keep their grades up for sports, the retake redo option is a great option for those students because they need to maintain a certain grade point average, and they know that maybe the second assessment's not coming for a little while. Similarly, on a teacher end, I may ask a student to retake or revise an assessment if I feel that the skills are so foundational that I don't feel comfortable throwing them into the second assessment without knowing that they are confident with that earlier learning. So if a student can't identify a theme in literature in a short story, I'm not going to throw them into a novel. That wouldn't be fair to them. And in a way, I should already know what I will get, because if they can't do it with a short story, I sure shouldn't expect them to do it with a novel. And so that may be also another place where the retake and redo policy that we have really comes into play, because I want to make sure that they've got that early stage of learning on score 1 before I would throw them into score 2 or score 3 as a more complex assessment.
Okay, excellent. The last question that came in was just wondering about what PD did you provide to your teachers before implementing this new grading system?
It was a process with every teacher involved in large group meetings all the way throughout the process. And then people would break out and try different things, come back together as a group. So the PD was really problem solving. It wasn't something that was developed and delivered to the teachers. It was something that was developed by the teachers.
Excellent. That looks like all the questions that we have now. We'll let you guys continue with your presentation.
So what we wanted to do was move from individual standards to this big question of letter grade, and Mr. Mead will step in and talk about this other component of our grading system.
So the second big question, so up to this point, just to clarify, we've talked about in the first chunk, kind of what is generally standards-based grading in the research that's out there. Mr. Midkiff then talked about how do we identify individual standard scores using the Decade system. And the last piece we're going to talk about is once you have 15 or 20 standard scores using that Decade system we just talked about, how do you combine all of those into one letter grade? And the big question we started with that, and it really was just asking the staff, what are we looking for? What are we really after? Are we after A, students, or A, work? And again, that idea of identifying and separating learning from compliance and behavior. We wanted to see a consistency of performance, proficiency across all standards. We got to this question when we looked at combining standards. How do we do that? If we average them all together, then there are some gaps. There are some things that we miss. We asked ourselves, what does a letter grade mean? And what came out of that was people started to talk about what an A student is. And the descriptors were all about work habits. And it was kind of a light bulb moment when someone realized we're talking about work habits, not learning. And so that took us to, again, that question of how do we represent consistency of performance. And we came to understand that averaging hides performance deficits. If I am highly proficient in 5 standards and there is one that I have no concept of or no proficiency in, that's not going to show in my final letter grade if we average, because the standards that I am highly proficient in are going to cover that up. So we understood that in order to get rid of gaps and really address the emerging areas that our students, or emerging standards that our students needed help and support with, then we could not use an averaging system. So then the question became, what do we do if we're not going to average? So we came up with, based on the work of Robert Marzano and his rubrics, which Mr. Midkiff referenced earlier, we came up with a system. In one of his books, Robert Marzano talks about conjunctive grading. And basically, what it means is that you have a set of thresholds. And the first threshold is on the left-hand side here. So this is 60% of individual scores are at a certain level, at or above a certain level. So for this student, for example, if 50 or 60% of my standard scores are at or above a 3, that starts me here. Now, if we were just to average, again, there could be some gaps in learning. So what the second part of this rubric or matrix does is that it says that there are no individual decade standard scores below a certain threshold. For example, if I had 60% of my standard scores were 3 or above, however, I had a 1.5 somewhere in those standard scores, that would pull me down to a B-. If all of my remaining scores besides that 60% were at a 2.5 or higher, then that would put me at a B+. Now, similarly, if I had a really low score that was bringing me down, and I had 3.0 or higher on all of my standard scores, but I had a 1.0 in one of my standards, that would put me at a C. Now, what this does is it causes students to focus on and be aware of all of their standard scores and to strive for proficiency in all of their standard scores. It's meant to, their grade drops significantly if they score poorly on a standard. What this is meant to do is it's meant to alarm the student, but not be alarming. So we want students to recognize I need to work on this particular standard, but at the same time, if they have an outlier that's at a 1 and they bring that up to a 2.5, that jumps them quickly from the C range back up to the B+ range. So again, the idea is that 60% or the majority of their standard scores are above a certain threshold. That places them on the left-hand column of the rubric. Then we look at their lowest standard score out of that additional 40%, and that tells us where they fall ultimately on the grade breakdown. Now, at this point, and I'm going to leave this slide up, are there any questions about how we combine those standard scores into a letter grade? Be happy to address those at this point.
I did get one question that it's not exactly what you were asking, but one of our members asked, are the standards explicitly shown to students?
Yes. They're both explicitly shown to students, and they're packaged in student-friendly language through learning targets and objectives.
Yeah. So, for example, in any project that I would teach, I would have the rubrics available to students. Additionally, whenever we have a formal assessment, part of that assessment, for me, includes students actually assessing themselves. They have a copy of the rubric, and they need to score themselves using that rubric and provide a brief justification. Now, my push with that to the students is I want them looking at that language there. I want them looking at what am I asking for. It also then is an honesty point that, all right, if a student scores themselves really poorly, maybe that's a conversation for us to talk about self-esteem. They may have done better than they're giving themselves credit for. Similarly, if they score themselves a 2.5 and I score them a 2.5 as well when I look at their work, the question is similarly honest, but it's well, why'd you stop? What's the gap here? In your, you not scoring yourself a 3, you knew it was a 2.5. What do you know that you do next? And so, yeah, the whole process really is about that transparency, starting from the beginning of a unit with, here are the rubrics. Here's what we are after by the end of this unit.
Great. Another question came in from Angela asking, is it possible for you guys to share an example of a student rubric?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and we can do that right now, and then we'll also provide a toolbox as well. Is it in the toolbox?
Great. She also asked, who was responsible for breaking down all of the standards into objectives for all subject areas and grade levels?
Again, that process of our teachers getting together, we have phenomenal teachers who give up time each week to develop those rubrics and standards, and then we house those in a bank of rubrics so that we have language around different standards that teachers can access.
And just so maybe I could respond to the question with a question, are we talking about daily objectives? So a student walks into my classroom here in first period in just a moment, and there's an objective up on the board. Are we talking about those kind of objectives, or are we talking about unit objectives? In which case, I would probably clarify and say learning outcomes in terms of verbiage.
Let's see, it doesn't look like, I'll give her a second to further elaborate on her question if she wants to type it in. Unit objectives, learning outcomes aligned with the standard is what she was wondering about.
So honestly, that is an ongoing process that Mr. Mead referenced, that bank of rubrics. That is not by any means a complete set where we have, 6 through 12, all of the reading literature standards laid out in a continuum. I think that's really a growth point for us at this point in developing our system, is coming up with vertically aligned systems. Now, I mean, really, that's going to come with practice as, teachers implement standards and teach them in their classes, and then we start to look at how do they align, how does 7th grade build into 8th grade, and so forth.
And we are pulling up a student rubric. Are there any other questions?
Feel free to type those questions into that chat window so that I can share them with our presenters.
And I'm going to move away from this screen, and we're going to pull up one of those student rubrics.
Okay.
Go to shared with me.
So I'll let you talk through.
All right, so this would be one related to reading literature. That's my comfortable spot.
Are you guys seeing it on your screen right now?
Yeah, we can see it on our end.
You can see is it a colored rubric or a white rubric?
It's a white one.
Okay, perfect.
All right. So this is about character analysis, and in particular right now we're looking at To Kill a Mockingbird. So I was really trying to push students to think about character development in the context of a novel, right? And how they're not only just characters that change and develop, but they also impact other characters. They impact, their actions impact the overall plot, and they also further, and this is the push, I guess, in freshman English, is how do they develop the theme? How do they develop the big takeaway, the big ideas from a novel? So what you'll see is that each level, 4, 3, and 2, are actually laid out. Now, in looking at the standard, that was something I had to do as a professional, is look at the standard and say, what is being asked for here? And then I had to think about the spiraling. All right, in my mind, what is meeting standard, which is a 3? What is exceeding that standard, going beyond the 9th, 10th grade expectation? And then what is approaching that, or what is the 2 level? And so what you'll see is that the first bullet point in the 2 addresses the same kind of things that the first bullet point in the 3 category addresses. And that spirals up further so that the first bullet point in the 4 category is also related to those bullet points. So students can see from those bullet points how a specific aspect of that rubric develops 2-level, 3-level, 4-level. So does that give us some context? Does that generate more questions, perhaps?
No, I think that's really helpful to see that real live rubric. One question that did come in was just wondering if you are applying kind of a power standards practice at all, or how are you kind of honing in on which specific standards, since there are so many?
Yes, you have to. I mean, I think I would probably rip my eyebrows out if I had to do absolutely everything. So ultimately, as an English teacher, I'm going to say, my writing standards, especially having taught at our middle school and now teaching at our high school exclusively this year, I'm looking at the continuum between informational writing and argumentative writing. Honestly, 7th, 8th grade, yes, we did argumentative writing, but I was really trying to give students a strong foundation in informational writing, because I know that will prepare them well for this year, for next year, and further into high school when, argumentative or claim-based writing becomes critical, right? So, yeah, we do have to prioritize. Now, something I do try to do as we go through the year is use some of our diagnostic testing. So, like many other districts, we've got reading diagnostic testing that has to be done up through freshman level. And actually, even just as recently as last night, I was looking through the winter diagnostic and saying, what standards did students perform well on, and what ones did they not? How many students do I have not performing well on the standard, and how's that going to shape my instruction and my planning in the remainder of the year?
And then from a system perspective, the other approach is some type of vertical alignment and figuring out a progression of standards over time, like Mr. Midkiff talked about. So if a standard's going to get hit hard sophomore year in English class, let's say, is that something that we don't need to address as much freshman year? So if you can vertically align and think of at a certain point, what skills do we want students to have, then you can work, backwards from that and figure out how, as a system, you're going to work students through those standards.
Absolutely. Just looking to see if we have any more questions coming through. Is there any collaboration across those grade levels then with this process? It sounds like, you are, having some higher saturation points in certain grades. What does that look like? Are there vertical kind of meetings that take place to discuss some of these, standards and those kind of more focused standards?
Yes. So part of the way our program works is that teachers individually have signed on to a second, staff meeting, if you will. What it really is collaboration. And so Thursday mornings before school for an hour, that is a secondary meeting that is really just focused on collaboration. Now, that takes a variety of forms. One of those is that vertical alignment component, where we really look at where are we moving students over time, and how are we doing that? How are we setting each other up for success, and how are we making sure that, the senior expectations on a given standard are clear so that we can start planning with those 6th grade teachers to say, how are we getting them there? One of the strengths of a small program and being a 612 is that we also have teachers that have taught or do teach at both. So in my case, the last few years, I've taught a bit at the high school, but primarily at the middle school. Now, this year, I'm primarily, actually exclusively at our high school campus, and That allows me then to say, all right, I had these writing rubrics, for example, in the 7th and 8th grade band. Now I'm going to use those to build my 9th and 10th grade level rubrics, and I'm going to think about how those things are spiraling and building on each other so that I'm pushing students' proficiency from 8th grade into their freshman year.
And then we've also looked at, in those collaborative times, we've started to look at, through some PLC work, curriculum mapping, just venturing into that to try to identify what's covered in each course, and then, for the purpose of how do we then align things with the end in mind of where we want students to be and what skills we want them to have in line with our mission and vision statement, work them back, where do we need to start, what do we need to implement each year, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'll give everybody just another couple of minutes for some questions to come in. I have a question. Now that you've gone through this process, what advice would you give a school who's looking to kind of convert their grading process like you did?
I would say permission to fail. That's the very first thing. Wading through this, digging out what exactly is asked for by a standard, developing rubrics, all of that. That's a very huge and complex process, one that we're not by any means like looking backwards on now. We're right in the middle of it. So you're going to make mistakes in recognizing that the system is going to and needs to be flexible to change. So permission, I guess, from district, from admin, within department teams, teacher to teacher, that it's a learning process that you're learning alongside of each other and with each other, and ultimately the goal of that is noble or ethical, right? It's to benefit our students and their learning.
And also, I think I would add to that, there's a question earlier about how do you communicate to parents and things. I think with the community, communicating and being transparent with the community that, hey, this is something we're working on. It's we believe a better way to do things, but we're going to make some mistakes. We're not perfect. Getting your community to understand that, but for them to understand why you're doing this. We're doing this because it will better serve our students. And if that's the lens you take and that permission to fail and not languish in that failure, but rebuild it in a better way, that is at the heart, I think, of how the transition takes place.
Excellent. Another question came through just wondering, how long, obviously this is a process and it's still going on, but how long did it kind of take you from the beginning to kind of being in the groove of things now? How long did that process kind of take?
We started this process in staff meetings like February of 2 years ago, where it started with that collaborative discussion process and a lot of, big questions like, does averaging represent learning? Last year was our first year actually using this system after we'd spent, basically all of our second semester of the previous year discussing it. Last year we used it. We were, very hands-on, highly critical of the system. We made some refinements, we think refinements anyway, to it, and have continued with it this year. So right now we're sitting at about 2 years from kind of the initial questions stage.
And we opened about, 5 years ago, and when we opened, we ventured into basing our projects and lessons on standards. So there was kind of an evolution process there of starting out by developing our instruction, teacher as designer, and developing our instruction around the standards to get comfortable with those, and that process, and found out through that process that then averaging those standard scores was not getting us what we wanted, and then so it's been a ongoing process of implementing standards-based instruction and then coming to our standards-based grading system of a number of years.
How are you measuring success in terms of this process and this new grading system?
We have a number of ways that we track data. We look at grade breakdowns and things like that over the years. We, in staff meetings, talk about what is our student grade breakdown this year compared to last year at the same time, compared to the previous year at the same time. to make sure that, you know, we are not doing a disservice to our students and that we are accurately representing their learning. So that's one way. We have what's called the standards data dashboard, where we track how many students are meeting proficiency in the different standards collectively, so we can see some trends. And then also, like David mentioned earlier, district and state assessments that tell us, you know, are we hitting the mark on a more universal scale.
Absolutely. We have a question from Robin, just wondering if how they can get more information on the rubrics shown on slide 20. Now, I know that you guys are sharing your contact information on the screen. Can we encourage people to reach out to you with questions?
Yes, and then we will also send we have a little toolbox that we put together that we'll send some PDFs over that include rubrics and some other things that include those documents that we shared today, and we'll also send you at Rubicon a PDF of the PowerPoint. And so people can pull information off of there. Is there somewhere you can post it with the webinar?
Yeah, we'll have them on our website at Rubicon.com. So we will have, just so everybody knows, 24 hours after this event ends, anybody who's registered or attended today will get a recording of the webinar, and so we'll have that recording posted on our webinars page. And we're also going to be writing a companion blog, just kind of highlighting everything that you've shown. And so that'll be published on our blog, and we'll include some of those PDF resources as well.
And I'd also say, yeah, please reach out via email, whether we're, you want to continue the conversation via email or a short phone call, Skype, whatever. This is something I think, we're really passionate about, because we think this is a better way to represent our students' learning, and so any chance we get to share that, I know I'd be happy to talk with people more about it, email or on the phone.
And if you're local, we'd be happy to meet with you, and you're always welcome to come take a tour of the school and see it in action as well.
Excellent. What a generous offer. And just in case some people missed it at the beginning, you're located in Vancouver, Washington, so just close to us here across the river in Portland.
Correct.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like there are any more questions coming through right now. But we really appreciate your time this morning and your expertise on this process. This is certainly, I'm giving a lot of people who've joined us today some food for thought. And as I shared before, everybody will get a recording of the webinar 24 hours after the event ends. And we're also going to be, as I said, writing that companion blog and sharing those resources that the team from Vancouver iTech will be sharing.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah,
we appreciate everyone's time and questions.